Are you a practitioner helping families plan for their futures? Do you specialise in trusts, inheritance and estate planning? If so, join STEP, the leading global network of trust and estate professionals. Whether you're an expert or just starting out, we're here for every stage of your career. Trial the STEP Journal for free at www.step.org/today and see what membership can offer you.
You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todayswillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello and welcome along to the latest Today's Wills and Probate podcast. Today we're talking about mental health and well-being in the sector, and I have Trish McLellan, Director of Engagement, and Niamh Warnock, Engagement and Relationship Manager at LawCare, with me to discuss the output of the Life in the Law 2025 survey. Great to have you both on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining. It's really helpful in the first instance to get a feel for who we've got on the discussion. So before we kind of go into the content of the report and some of the lessons and learnings from it, perhaps in the first instance, you might tell us a little bit about yourself and your roles at LawCare, please, Trish.
Thank you, David. We're absolutely delighted to be here. When I first joined LawCare a good number of years ago, initially I worked on our direct support channels before my role developed into more of a wider engagement one, working with funders and stakeholders, and along with other colleagues such as Niamh, who's here with me this morning. I work on delivering our training. I worked on our recent reverse mentoring toolkit and was involved, as well as this most recent research, Life in the Law 2025. I was also involved in our previous report that was published in 2021.
Thanks, Trish. Niamh?
Hi, David. I joined LawCare back in 2022, and similar story to Trish in that I initially started out as support and volunteer coordinator, and then after around a year or so with LawCare, I moved more into an engagement role. I'm still involved in the support services, but I work mainly alongside Trish, delivering the training, conducting research like the report that we're discussing today, responding to various consultations that we see released across the legal sector, and also continuing to engage with stakeholders and funders across all of the jurisdictions that we cover at LawCare.
Fab, great introductions. Thank you so much. So the topic of discussion today is this Life in the Law research that's been published. A bit of an eye-opener. On the front page, it says, "Wake up, act now." There's obviously some output here that law firms need to really take notice of. Tell us a bit about LawCare, Niamh, and why it was founded, what its objectives, please.
Okay, so around about 28 years ago now, LawCare was originally set up. It was initially in response to a perception that people in the legal sector may have been relying on alcohol, perhaps to an unhealthy degree, to help cope with various demands of practice. But we all very quickly saw from the support channel, which at that stage was just a helpline, that one of the primary reasons for contact was stress. And we found that people were using various different things as coping mechanisms to combat that stress. And then over the years, the work of LawCare evolved to meet these different trends that we saw and changed a lot in those 28 years. So LawCare is the mental health charity for the legal sector. One of our main aims is to offer free, confidential and emotional support to anybody who either studies or works in the legal sector across the jurisdictions that we cover, which is the UK, the Channel Islands and Isle of Man. We also do our best to advocate for improvements in mental health practices within legal workplaces and to lead for transformation across education, training and research, which we'll touch upon when we're discussing the report a bit further on today. In the last year, we've seen quite an increase in demands for support, and in our impact report for 2024, we noted that last year we we had people reaching out to LawCare more than 1,000 times for support, which was our most ever contacts in a single year. And that was actually a 13% increase on the year before. So whilst we're better known perhaps by some for our direct support services, we also are doing this other work in the background, such as the research which formed the report that we're here to talk about today. We also have lots of other resources that we add to on a pretty much constant basis. And if anybody was interested in those, a really good way to keep an eye on those is to either sign up for our monthly newsletter, which you can do by just filling in a couple of quick details on our website, or to follow us on social media. We find that the legal sector are particularly invested in the content that we put out on LinkedIn. So ongoing from everything that we hear on our direct support channels and from the coverage that we had of our last Life in the Law report, we saw that the stats were being constantly quoted in different legal journals, articles, blogs, and talked about at webinars, panel sessions, etc. So we realized that we probably needed to update the information that we were putting out. So that sort of led us into this new Life in the Law 2025 research, where we worked alongside Dr. Emma Jones as our lead academic. She is from the University of Sheffield, held a series of roundtables and discussed what angle we were going to take this time round and made some slight tweaks to how we conducted our survey back in 2020.
We're going to come on to some of the kind of key differences between that first piece of research in 21 to this latest piece of research, but let's get right into the kind of meat of the output. Interestingly and importantly, this is not just a piece of work that highlights all of the problems, Trish. The idea here, and as far as LawCare are concerned, the ambition is to try and create solutions to the problem as well, isn't it? Tell us about some of the key statistics that have come out of the report that are really of concern to LawCare.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. Yes, we are very keen that we stop admiring the problem and focus much more on the solutions. But to understand those, it is useful to have the evidence that shapes those recommendations for change. We were delighted that we had a really good spread across the jurisdictions we cover, a very good spread of a variety of practice areas and different roles in the sector, including in support service, in the support aspects of legal services delivery and business services. There was a really good age spread and PQE range. We also made the deliberate decision to expand some of our questions from our last report, and we asked about future plans. We wanted to understand whether people were content to stay with their, the same organisation or even in the sector altogether, because we do see that through our support channels that we get a high percentage of contacts who are questioning their career options. We used recognised, validated research scales to gather quantitative data because that is important. But alongside that, we also used open text boxes because we wanted to get that qualitative data and to help us have a much more nuanced understanding of what the issues are. As you can imagine, there is a huge amount of data, but what I'll do is I'll attempt to summarise the main headlines. So almost 60% reported poor mental well-being, with over 40% saying it was significantly influenced by work. We had one junior solicitor commenting that his days, or their days, are filled with work Monday to Friday, from getting up to going to bed after midnight. So there's no time for any other activity that might influence their answers. Over 50%, over half, 56% said they could see themselves leaving their current workplace within the next 5 years, with 32% saying they could leave the sector entirely. People in the sector are at high risk of burnout, and this is where people feel either emotionally exhausted by or disengaged in their work. And that exhaustion is caused by prolonged unmanaged stress. We saw almost 79% saying they regularly work beyond their contracted hours, with 8.5% saying that they worked an extra 21 plus hours a week extra. I mean, that is quite staggering. We also measured psychological safety, and that really is a really good assessment of whether or not a workplace culture is healthy. It's how safe people feel to raise concerns, ask questions, suggest ideas for change, mention if they're uncertain about or are lacking in confidence about how they're delivering the work. And the average score was in the lower part of the survey range, demonstrating that people don't always feel psychologically safe. And we had a paralegal in England telling us that they feel that there will always be a stigma against people with mental health issues, and they've never felt safe discussing it. We did, it's fair to say, have some sharing their views about working in a much healthier, positive working environment, with one person saying that regular one-to-ones enable you to discuss issues, stresses, etc. before they become too big, and allow you to let managers know what pressures you're dealing with and if your mental health is being affected. And really, that's what we need to be getting to. Rather than driving concerns underground, we need to get to a point where the sector feels very comfortable with people working in it, discussing the challenges. Yes, there are huge benefits to working in the sector, but it can come at a cost. And what we did see, that almost a fifth reported having experienced bullying, harassment, or discrimination. And really worryingly, when asked if they felt if that treatment had been dealt with appropriately, over 70% said they hadn't. They didn't feel it had, sorry. And perhaps unsurprisingly, those who were experiencing poor mental health and well-being, and those who were demonstrating a higher risk of burnout or higher work intensity, had lower levels of psychological safety. Again, we did have respondents who were happy with working in the legal sector, loving their field of work, but also pointing out they didn't feel it's necessarily for everyone, and noting things almost as if they are to be expected, like high work intensity, a lot of pressure, poor work-life balance. And obviously, it's a well-paid profession. We can't expect it to be stress-free. But that data, those headlines, very much demonstrate the significant impact that working practices are having on people in the sector and their mental health, and worryingly, scary possible attrition rates unless we take some action.
Have we got some indication as to why the legal workplace is in this sort of condition? Why do people sort of feel as though they have to leave their jobs? Why do people feel as though they have to leave their sector? Is there something inherent about the legal profession that we know of, or that the research is bringing out?
Well, it seems to suggest working practices, David. When I was mentioning earlier that people were unhappy with a poor work-life balance, that came out strongly. Very, very high risk of burnout, and that is driven by unmanaged, prolonged stress. Work intensity, people working way beyond their contracted hours. I mean, they aren't necessarily, they are manageable, but there is evidence that they clearly aren't being managed in many environments. And that is driving those people to feel that they either need to try a different environment, it could just be thinking of moving in houses against private practice, or the reverse, or it could be them feeling that they need to try a different practice area, or it could be them thinking, I've seen too much of this and I'm considering getting out altogether. because these are systemic issues in law that are impacting their mental health.
We know that law historically has almost got this expectation of overworking. And as you say, in some areas of law, not in all, the remuneration is reasonable. But there seems to be this sort of expectation that, that comes with the territory. Is that still, prevalent in this report as far as you can see, or is that culture changing?
I think there is some degree of change, but it isn't comprehensive enough. It is patchy, and there are organizations that are doing good work, but it's very much on a reactive level when people get into difficulties implementing changes, or certainly looking at what they can do for that individual. And there's clearly work being done in raising awareness about the importance of mental health and well-being, but it isn't deep enough. What's coming through loud and clear is that, the focus on profitability and client satisfaction seems to be trumping the mental health of people who are delivering those legal services, because of course it's clear that it isn't, the ripple effects are going to go beyond the individual. If we are risking burning out and losing talented people, declining mental health of people that remain in the business, you're going to see greater sickness absence and impact on profitability, mistakes and complaints possibly. And that runs a risk of the reputation of the profession being impacted. We're a world-renowned legal sector, but we're only as good as the people in it, and we need to look after them because the evidence is there of the far-reaching consequences if we don't do so.
Recruitment and retention is usually second or third on the partners meeting, isn't it? And I've certainly heard that reflection that a happy, healthy workforce makes fewer mistakes, and certainly in departments like conveyancing, for example, that it's only going to be a positive. What about benchmarking legal against other professions, though? Because these are astonishing statistics. Half of people saying that they could see themselves leaving their current workplace the next 5 years. A third of them could well leave the sector. Is that the same in other professional services sectors?
Well, I mean, the looking even at the wider population, you've got stress, depression and anxiety amounting for about half of workplace absences, according to health and safety executive figures. You've got figures from the likes of Deloitte demonstrating billions of pounds being expended each year in terms of lost working days because of poor mental health and well-being. And also on the positive, demonstrating about a £5 return for every £1 invested in improving workplace mental health. I suppose it's fair to say that there are other professions which have similar expectations and demands and the like, but in many ways does that not take us away from, it doesn't deny the existence of the problem in the sector. I think that's quite distracting in some ways, and it almost seeks to minimize the impact. So I think it's important to keep the focus on, we have the data for our sector, and I mean, lawyers are competitive, but do we want to be better or worse than accountants or medics? I think I very much see that this is a piece of research that demonstrates clear issues within our sector and the absolute need to take account of the data and take positive steps to try to improve the working practices in law. And ultimately, we firmly believe that will have a significant positive impact on the mental health of people working within it.
One of the things I wanted to pick up in the report is the prevalence of bullying and harassment and discrimination in law, an issue that was brought to light by Baroness Harriet Harman's report into the Bar Council as well. What's the attitude in the report to bullying and harassment, and how is it impacting the profession?
Well, that is something that we, as I mentioned, almost a fifth had experienced bullying, harassment or discrimination, and also mentioned that a large majority didn't feel it had been appropriately dealt with. And unfortunately, that is no surprise to us. And it's certainly, going back decades, very similar statistics coming out with no significant improvement with other bodies of research. And that's just simply not good enough. We hear that through our support channels, and certainly the report indicated that when we asked where people felt this bullying, harassment or discrimination was coming from, a majority, about 65%, said managers and supervisors, which is why I know we're going to come on to discuss our recommendations, which is why we need to make sure that we train our managers and supervisors. Some felt it was coming from their peers, and again points to us needing to look at the culture in the sector. Some finding it was from clients, and again, we need to make sure organisations are managing client expectations and supporting their team members. And we did have people pointing to judicial bullying, which is why the Harman report, and the lengthy recommendations that she came up with would hopefully make some improvement. But we're very much absolutely of the opinion that we do not want to see in the next report similar statistics. So we need to tackle root causes around the culture and around the working practices.
Well, that neatly leads on to my next question around what are the lessons that we can take away from comparisons between the 2021 report and 2025. Are things changing? Are things improving? Are things getting worse?
Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
So certainly when we entered into our work on this new survey, one of the things we wanted to look at was what the landscape was now like post-COVID. It's been 5 years since we last asked questions, and we wanted to get a bit of an update. So whilst our new survey and report is comparable in some ways to our first study, it's not directly comparable. This time around we had two surveys. We wanted to gather additional information. We wanted to hear from the individual voices, but we also wanted to ascertain what organisations were doing at the same time in the sector. We've asked slightly different questions and approached some of the topics and themes from slightly different angles. We also appreciate that the pool of people who answered and responded to both surveys, whilst some may be people who answered first time round, it's unlikely to be all the same people. So we've sort of kept that in mind whilst we have been considering the outcomes of this new report. But, some of the things that we noted was that, sort of as a very broad and sweeping statement, that across the board, similar statistics were found against the different scales that we measured against in terms of psychological safety, work intensity, and how people generally felt with their mental well-being. We found that there was little real improvement that could be seen from the statistics of the report. And one of the new parts that we asked about was the intentions that people had for their careers, for their future careers. And really, those results were, for some, probably quite shocking at the high levels of people who were considering either leaving their own organisation or just going, that's me, I'm stepping away from the sector. And I suppose it's the thought that despite us perhaps not doing a fully direct comparison, we can see that the statistics and the findings, they're all interrelated, and the same sorts of themes are appearing in that those people who said that they were experiencing poor mental health and well-being, they were also the people who were at higher risk of burnout, and that those who had higher work intensity levels were also those who felt that they had lower levels of psychological safety. So really, we feel that our report probably adds in a lot of ways to a growing body of evidence, in some cases international evidence, when we look at the reports of the IBA as well, that lots of them are telling the same story, that people in the legal sector are under a lot of strain at times. The work is intense, long hours are commonly heard of, and that people do find it hard to admit when they're struggling. I think one of the quotes that Trish mentioned earlier was that somebody said that they felt there would always be a stigma against people with mental health issues, and that it would be quite tricky for a lot of people to discuss it openly. We did find that there seemed to be a suggestion that things are making small progress. That was one of the positives. There is small progress being seen across the board there about more discussion about mental health at work, more organisations routinely providing programmes and resources. But unfortunately, it's not necessarily always translating into improved mental well-being, as the findings of the report suggest that those levels are still remaining low. But we think that what we need to do and what we need to continue to do and do our small part in is trying to help to reframe that kind of discussion about mental health. And as we've talked about it before, stepping away from reacting simply to when something occurs to a certain situation or a certain individual's experience, reacting to that and trying to in some way fix that problem or support them in that moment, to seeing what we can do across the board in a more preventative way, thinking about what changes can be made, what things can be brought in at a more organisational wide structure that will help everybody within the structure, with everybody in the organisation, and different small measures that we feel have been suggested from the really rich data that we have recovered from these surveys. That was something that was really, really interesting for us working through it. Was, you know, you could hear people's stories in the background. We could really glean from a lot of personal experiences. So whilst, for example, the report picks out only a few key quotes that we thought were particularly useful or sets out specific statistics, there's a lot more information that we have that we hope to use moving forward that's really, really rich in terms of how people were really feeling in their own words, and we hope to be able to use that moving forward to help shape further resources. We're going to be taking this work is going to continue. The release of the report is not the end point for us at LawCare. It's been our first stage gathering together the key high level information, and that's starting us off. And then we're going to take that further with discussions. The discussions will continue with the sector. We're still working out exactly what that's going to look like, but certainly just to say that, you know, this is for us really a starting point, and our work will continue in this space, and we'll continue to do what we can to help influence change. We're a very small organisation, but we're quite well placed to work with the regulators and training bodies across all the sectors and the law societies, all the different bodies that all link together. So we hope to continue conversations with them to discuss and see what can be done next.
Well, I want to come on to some of those really practical things that we can do to support ourselves and obviously as firms as well. But before I do, it's a loaded question in some respects, in that is there a risk that the results of surveys like this are skewed or can be skewed because of the nature of the survey? The people who are most affected are most likely to respond to them. Therefore, we might see elevated results where people who aren't so affected don't respond. Is that a critique that you take into account or that you recognise?
I think it's a very fair question. It's a fair point, and we have don't have control over who reaches out and decides to take the time to respond to the survey. We know that some people will make comments like that and state that it's only the people who are particularly aggrieved who have reached out. However, us having the ability to see all of the responses, we can confirm that that isn't the case. It wasn't all doom and gloom, what every single respondent said, but even those people who came back and said that they loved their job, they loved the field of law they were in, they loved the impact that they felt that they were making through their job, they still pointed to things that they felt could be improved within the sector. They still acknowledged that there were difficulties within the sector. They still acknowledged that the work intensity could be really high from time to time, that the pressures were increasing. You know, people who said that they were happy and that had no intentions of leaving might still have pinpointed different aspects, such as increased demands from all angles coming at them. That was a bit of a theme that came through, that people felt that since COVID times, when the whole landscape really felt like it flipped on its head within the legal sector in terms of the way people more commonly worked. We heard a lot from people saying that, you know, that created that always on kind of possibility, that people had their phones, they had their laptops, they were at home. There was the ability, therefore, for them to respond to things out of hours in a way that they possibly wouldn't have been able to before. If they left the laptop in the office, you know, they might not have been able to pick up that query. This is sort of surmising across lots of different themes that we heard, but it's certainly to say that, you know, we were pleased also with the really wide set of respondents that we had. We know that there can sometimes be comments of people saying that, you know, it's generational differences. Perhaps the people who said these things were all only starting out and they don't understand what way the sector works. But we can also confirm that we had a really, really good spread, and we were really pleased to see that we had so many people quite far through their careers coming to the survey and providing their responses. So yes, it's fair to say, you know, that certain people will gravitate towards these surveys, but we did feel that we did get a good spread of responses.
So if we take all of that into account, and as we said at the start of the podcast, we consider that this is as much a piece of work that attempts to cover off some of the solutions to this, as well as identifying the problems. I know there are 5 kind of key areas that LawCare have identified as ways in which individuals and firms can tackle this issue. Trish, do you want to give us a synopsis of where we go from here?
Yes, absolutely, David. We did, when we asked what people wanted to see, there were 3 main themes to those. They wanted a greater focus on wellbeing and mental health support. They wanted an improvement in workplace culture, and they wanted working practices to change. And so we used those when we came to focus on the recommendations and what might achieve those ambitions. So a key thing is we must try and get these burnout levels down, and that involves more actively managing workloads, rethinking targets, and challenging the culture of long hours. Long hours they're often treated as almost inevitable, but they're not. They're a sign of systemic issues, and they can be fixed. We also need to prioritise and value managing people, because we saw from the data that this is undervalued and often under-resourced within organisations, with only just over half of managers surveyed having received any training and less than a third having their targets adjusted. Managers have a huge impact on how people experience their work, so effective people management is not an optional extra, it's an essential. Because where we did hear from people where management time was more appropriately valued, they were making comments such as, I have a reduced time and billing target. We're asked to provide training as part of our KPIs, which ties in with my role. We also need to look at embedding hybrid and flexible working options to make sure we're meeting diverse needs, because we can see from the survey how much these are valued, but they need to be implemented carefully, because otherwise people were pointing to a potential loss of social connection with their colleagues and increased isolation. So it's important that we engage with colleagues and have a conversation around how and what might work. Because if it's done well, it can have a really positive impact. Someone's saying working from home has been a game changer for them in terms of managing childcare and managing their disability, and saying that they feel it's prolonged their career by 10 years. That's a senior solicitor saying that. But it's vital that we evaluate the programs that we're implementing and make sure that they're working. We can then see what isn't working and tweak it and where additional improvements are needed. We also recommended that it is vital to continue to consider and keep under review the pathway into practice, to make sure that legal education is equipping future lawyers with more than just the technical legal expertise they clearly need, but also for the realities of working in the sector and giving them the tools and experience to make sure that they can manage their mental health throughout such challenging careers. We very much feel that they are achievable aims with the right will. We've got all the evidence we need of the extent of the issues, what might be causing them, how they're impacting on people, and crucially, what might help improve matters. And although the data in itself can't create change, it can provide the catalyst for it, and we firmly believe it's time for action.
Well, that is as much time as we have for the discussion. I'm incredibly grateful for you both in sharing all of your insight and information from the report. Where can people go to find it, can download it and review the content of it?
Absolutely. The report is easy to find on our website, www.lawcare.org.uk. We've got a search function at the top. If you type in Life in the Law, it will bring you to a page about the report with a few key stats, and then you can click through and read the entirety of the report.
Fab. Well, thank you so much both for joining the podcast. Thank you to Trish and to Niamh for your insight and for sharing the content of the report. The Today's Wills and Probate podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todayswillsandprobate.co.uk. My thanks to Trish and to Niamh. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todayswillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.